I recognize that we are getting towards the end of the day, and so
Everybody's
we
going.
better get a sparkling conversation going to get your attention. I'm delighted to share the podium with Michele Fiorentino, Executive Vice President for Strategy and Business Development of Baker Hughes. He'll in a moment tell you more about Baker Hughes, but obviously a company in the field of oil and gas, and that's your career for a very extended period now.
That's a big.
The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, BP, and Castrol. So a whole history in that field. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your company.
So yes, so for everybody to know, I do feel a little bit guilty about my career in oil and gas, and so I'm trying to fix it. And one reason I went to Baker Hughes was because of what we intended to do in terms of leaning sort of more towards into a low carbon economy. So in terms of Baker Hughes, I'll start from there, and then I'll say a few words about more specifically my role. It's really a service and technology company that really sort of delivers both technology and services all the way from sort of exploration, production to LNG, gas value chains to digital solutions across sort of the manufacturing and industrial world. So it's pretty sort of large span of activities. My role is to try to move the portfolio and both from a technology and a capital employed base a lot more into the low carbon economy, which is what we're going to talk about.
Absolutely. And I'm keen to get to that subject, but I cannot resist the temptation for a moment, in light of the context in which we're sitting here, the horrible war in the Ukraine, to ask you, some people believe that it is sort of a magic bullet to accelerate the pumping of oil and gas to solve the crisis and to address the shortage of supplies coming out of Russia. But what is your assessment? Can the oil and gas industry very quickly fill that hole, or is that timeline actually more tricky?
So, I mean, let me start from saying that what's happening is an absolute tragedy. And we shouldn't need that kind of bullet to achieve our net zero goals. So putting that aside for a moment, what that I think is doing in relation to our path to net zero, I think it's two things. One is raising the profile of sort of security of supply, and at the same time is raising the profile of something that comes with security of supply, which is diversify the supply source. And you put the two together, I think there is probably a positive momentum that will be derived from trying to achieve these two elements, sort of security and diversification, through sort of accelerating some of the low carbon sort of technologies that we move forward. In the short term, we believe clearly gas remains sort of the best candidate sort of to close the gap up until these technologies can deliver at scale what we need from a low carbon basis.
I think that gets us to some of these fundamental debates that we need to have, how fast we can deploy the low carbon solutions. Energy efficiency certainly is a lever we can pull immediately, but even wind and solar we can deliver at very rapid clip. How long will it take to increase oil production, say, out of Saudi and out of the Permian by a couple million barrels?
It isn't something that people can just turn the tap on. There is this kind of romantic image. I don't know whether it's romantic, that people sitting somewhere in the Middle East with their hands on a wheel and just turn the wheel up and down. The reality is there is lots of infrastructure that goes in and around an oil field to be able to not just produce, but produce it sustainably. And if you don't do that right, you might actually ruin the reservoirs, which then is going to hit you back later on. So in the very, very short term, the race is on between the Middle East and North America in terms of ramping up production. And so far, North America has been probably more quick on its feet to be able to increase production. So our view is that probably in the short term, that's where the gap will be closed rather than necessarily the Middle East.
And yet we have a host of technologies that get us to a more sustainable energy future. And it could well be that Europe will take the lead on those. Let's talk about some of those. What are the main areas where Baker Hughes is investing to drive towards a low carbon and sustainable future?
I mean, if you step back and you look at the sort of inevitable growth of primary energy demand, which you can argue sort of around the actual numbers, but it's clearly growing. Call it in the region of 9-10% over the next decade or so. Oil and gas inevitably will be part of the mix for the foreseeable future. And so if we ask ourselves, what is the problem that we're really trying to solve? It isn't necessarily changing the fuel. It isn't necessarily sort of eliminating carbon. It is eliminating CO2. So it's eliminating the emissions that come from those. And so the first immediate thing that we need to do is to clean up the process for producing the hydrocarbons that we will need to produce. And in that space, CCUS plays a key role. So one key plank of our sort of strategy, building a technology portfolio that positions us and helps our customer in their path to net zero, is carbon capture, utilization, and storage solutions. And that plays to our strength because we know what a sequestration technology needs to be. We understand the geophysics of reservoir. We understand what storing stuff underground takes. We understand how to move gas, how to compress gas, and we're now developing utilization technologies in order to create a revenue stream on the back of gas because of CO2. Because in the end, capturing it is okay, but if you can do something useful with it, is even better.
One fundamental premise you laid out at the beginning of this argument was that primary energy demand is going to continue to grow by 7 to 9%.
Yeah.
In the 80s, 70s and 80s, when the first oil crisis hit the world, we saw a decoupling of GDP growth from energy demand that actually would argue that there is a very conceivable scenario that energy demand growth will drop to very low single digits. At RMI, we believe that we, on the back of that, can now see in the rear view mirror the end of growth of fossil fuels. Can you imagine that?
The end of growth. So I think you have to distinguish. People tend to lump everything in one bucket. And I think there is a different conversation to be had around the liquid side of the fossil fuel mix, the solid side, and the gas side. The solid side, which is the black stuff called coal, is already sort of in decline. Even though even today, as we speak, 25% of the world primary energy is satisfied by coal. So there is a long way to go, before we eliminate that. And there's lots of CO2 that can be saved by just switching away from coal. Liquids, we probably see towards the back end of the decade, that peak being reached, everything else being equal. But gas, we believe, is going to continue to grow. A, because there is this 25% of coal that needs to be replaced. And B, the reality is one of the main pathways to decarbonizing the world is going to be electrifying it. Use electricity wherever you can, which then means power demand is going to go up and power will have to be generated. Now, we might get into hydrogen and other form of power generation. But sort of gas, in our view, is going to be a key transition and destination fuel to support that low carbon target.
There is certainly an alternative perspective, but we'll leave that for a moment. Here is the interesting question. One way that gas could be a destination fuel for the production of electricity is by deploying that CCUS. And yes, we have been talking about that as the pathway for decarbonizing fossil fuels for a long time. Frustratingly, we have seen very limited deployment of that technology until now, even though red lights have been blinking around the world about the urgency of scaling up that technology. Why do you think it hasn't happened yet?
I mean, a few reasons which will play, Jules, in terms of also in other technologies, and we should make sure that we treasure those learnings as the other technology look to be scaled up. One is lack of a very clear regulatory framework around the liability management that comes from handling large-scale CCUS operations. Two, there is an economics element that up until now has played a role. Now, that is starting to be addressed, because the social pressure is driving more technology development, and sort of the cost curve is coming down. But also, if you look today, sort of on the European sort of stock exchange, carbon credits are trading 80 euros per ton. You combine those two things together, it actually you have economic viability for CCUS. Now, sort of in order to do that, you still need to have an ecosystem of developers, technology provider, operators. The CO2 needs to be captured, and so capture technology needs to be deployed. You put it all together, that explains why it's taken so long. But there is no reason why we shouldn't accelerate that. And we very much hope that, and it's starting to come together. Look in the UK, sort of BP is now leading a consortium to drive a big, carbon hub up in the north of England. And there are similar clusters that are starting to take shape. So I'm optimistic.
I hope that your optimism is justified. I think it is critically important that we get that technology figured out. My view, maybe not for power generation, but that at least for heavy industry and for existing plants, and particularly in the Far East.
Can I offer, and I agree with you, but can I offer also another, is a bit more sort of out in terms of timeline, but sort of a view of gas, not just as gas, but as a vector for hydrogen. Sort of most people, when you think about hydrogen, think about electrolyzing water. I don't know how many people have scientific backgrounds, but if you take a molecule of water and try to break it to create hydrogen and oxygen, it takes about 7 times more energy to do that than bringing a molecule of methane and have twice as much hydrogen. Then you got this thing called carbon black. And imagine a world where we have a technology, we're not that far off, where you can take that carbon black, turn it into graphite, lower the cost point of graphite, and start producing structural elements like steel beams in construction. Then you have sort of created effectively a CO2-free hydrogen. You have found a substitute for steel, which is a big polluter from a CO2 standpoint. So, but to the theme of this conference, technology has a big role to play. It's not the only thing.
That is absolutely key, right? And we are seeing technology being mobilized in the area of hydrogen at a speed that I at least could not have imagined 3, 4, 5 years ago. But the crossover point between these two, blue and green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, i.e. from natural gas in steam methane reforming and carbon capture and storage, versus green, the trajectory of one cost coming down very rapidly, the trajectory of the other cost not yet that clear.
So when it comes to hydrogen, I mean, our view is that there's no doubt it will play a significant role moving forward. For power generation, a question mark. And again, it's basic science and basic thermodynamics that tells you, if I have to take a, sort of sun, turn it into electricity, to then use electricity to drive an electrolyzer, to then create hydrogen, then I have to transport the hydrogen wherever I need to use it, whether compressed, whether in liquid format. Then I have to put into fuel cells to come back to an electron. Why don't I just run a cable between the two places and use that very electron? I mean, the infrastructure that you need to do all of that is ginormous. Now, in replacing current consumption of gray hydrogen, where so you want to go into fertilizers, steel, so where there is a real use for hydrogen, no doubt. Maybe as a large storage capacity for long-term duration, hydrogen will have a role. But to power and transportation, I think the jury is still out. Interestingly enough, just I like numbers and statistics. Today, at today's gas price, ironically enough, and with today's cost of CO2, actually green hydrogen is cheaper than gray hydrogen, as things stand at the moment. Now, gas prices are
And
clearly...
green hydrogen continues to drop in price because 70% of the cost is wind and solar, right?
Yeah, I mean, the main driver for the cost is electricity cost. So the issue is what are those electricity costs be, and and then the the inherent efficiency of the system, the conversion, the point-to-point conversion.
I want to pivot to the last area that we said we were going to cover, which is taking the carbon out of the production of oil and gas. Right now, if you drive a little bit south of where I live to the Permian Basin, a big development area for oil and gas in the United States, you run from one flare into another. And if you map from a satellite, the other big environmental impact is methane leakage. The industry needs to clean up its act on those two parameters. And you are a service provider to that industry. What is Baker Hughes doing to stop flaring and address methane emissions?
I mean, the first thing I would say is, and I don't know how many of you followed or were at CETA Week just a couple of weeks ago, and just to play credit to the oil and gas industry, I happened to be on the panel where OGCI announced the zero emission pledge of all the members of OGCI, which include all the major oil producers. And that is a very welcome pledge. And is not net zero, is absolute zero, which is a great target to have. And there is no doubt that an easy picking is to reduce methane emissions. It might not be CO2, but it's a lot more harmful than CO2 from a...
Can you just clarify for the audience, because that is a very important point you just made, the difference between methane and CO2 in terms of causing climate change?
Yeah, I mean, if you take just from a pure impact on temperature rise, methane is 80 times more powerful than CO2.
80 times.
80 times.
So fixing that methane leakage is critically important.
Is critically important. From our standpoint, we've developed a bunch of technology from gas recovery systems, which we call Flare IQ, that effectively takes the gas that otherwise, would be flared, and either ensure that it's flared properly, because not many realize that today, when you flare methane, probably you flare at 70 to 80% efficiency, and so there is that 20% of methane that still goes in the air. And so we have technology to optimize that. But more importantly, we have technology to take that gas, compress it, turn it into power, and do something useful with it. We have technologies to, the drone technologies or land-based technologies to just pinpoint where the methane is. And, all of that is to the avail of the industry in order to reduce emissions. But one of the big problems in the Permian is actually not the large companies, not the members now of OGCI, it's all the independents, where in the end, the economics drive their decisions. While a big oil and gas producer, with a listing, is more sensitive to social pressures, for somebody who's just an independent, that might not be the case. And so regulation there has to play a big role. So there has to be a little bit of a stick to ensure compliance and that those emission technology, which are available today at very, very reasonable cost, are actually deployed.
So is it fair to conclude that for oil and gas to have an ongoing role for a transition period in the energy system, the need to deploy these solutions, carbon capture and storage, methane control, stopping flaring. Those tasks are at hand. And maybe the industry has not made enough work of those responsibilities in the past. Now is the moment to do it.
I think so, and I believe, in all the conversation I have with our partners, our customers, that realization is real, and certain, at least in the large companies, and the pledge with OGCI is a testament to that. That is now part of the boardroom discussions, and I don't think there is a single conversation I have with my strategy counterparts that doesn't talk about how do we get to net zero, and these are key ingredients to it.
It sounds like you have your work cut out for you. Folks, it is already time. This was a short fireside chat. I am delighted to now introduce to you Michael Bellabarba, who will take the stage for the next conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.